Commander Tim Harrow stood motionless in the observation deck of the stellar vortex, his hands clasped behind his back, as the vastness of the Orion Nebula stretched out before him. The starfield shimmered with hues of violet and gold, a deceptive tranquility that masked the growing unrest brewing among humanity's leaders. His reflection in the transparent viewport revealed a face hardened by decades of military service. A man too seasoned to be swayed by dreams of peace, yet not jaded enough to abandon hope entirely. The faint chime of his communicator pulled him from his thoughts. "Commander Harrow," came the voice of Lieutenant Rourke, his second-in-command, clipped and professional. "You're requested in the war room. General Locke and the Council are waiting." Tim exhaled slowly, his stomach nodding at the urgency in Rourke's tone. Meetings of this nature seldom brought good news. He turned on his heel, his polished boots echoing against the metallic flooring as he strode toward the lift. The war room hummed with subdued tension. A holographic map of the galaxy rotated above the central table, its flickering light casting sharp shadows on the grim faces of the gathered officers and counselors. General Victor Locke stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders rigid and his sharp, aquiline features betraying no emotion. Beside him was Kyle Ellison, the stellar vortex's chief engineer, his wiry frame dwarfed by the taller officers. Kyle's sharp eyes darted nervously between the council members, his characteristic wit uncharacteristically subdued. Tim entered with a nod to the assembly. "You summoned me, General." Locke gestured toward the table, where a grainy holographic transmission began to play. The image was unstable, the audio crackling with static, but the scene it displayed was unmistakable, a human colony engulfed in chaos. Buildings crumbled under the relentless assault of alien war machines, their sleek, insectoid frames darting across the battlefield. Screams echoed faintly through the recording before it abruptly cut to black. "What you just witnessed," Locke began, his voice cold and steady, "is the destruction of Epsilon 4, one of our outermost colonies." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This was no random act of violence. The Galactic Empire allowed it to happen. A murmur rippled through the room, but Tim's focus remained unshaken. "Allowed? Do we have proof?" Locke nodded to Captain Adrian Cole, a reconnaissance specialist known for his meticulous attention to detail. The younger officer stepped forward, his expression grim. "We intercepted this transmission from an Empire vessel in orbit around Epsilon 4. He tapped a control panel, and a second recording played, a conversation in the guttural, clicking language of the Zarkrell, one of the Empire's dominant species. Subtitles translated their words. "Proceed with the culling. The humans are breeding too quickly. Their growth threatens balance." Tim's jaw tightened. "Culling. That's what they see us as. A species to be managed." Locke's voice rose, commanding the room's attention. "For 4,000 years, humanity has abided by the Empire's laws, adhered to their treaties, and accepted their disdain. But this is a declaration of war, whether they speak it aloud or not." The silence that followed was palpable, the enormity of Locke's statement weighing on everyone present. It was Kyle who finally broke it, his voice tinged with disbelief. "War? Against the Empire? We're talking about the most advanced coalition of species in the galaxy. They outnumber us, outgun us, and they underestimate us," Locke interjected sharply. "They've grown complacent, relying on their superiority to keep us in line. But humanity has been preparing. Quietly, strategically." Tim crossed his arms, his tone measured but probing. "If we're discussing retaliation, we need to consider the consequences. What's the plan, General? Strike and hope they negotiate?" Locke's gaze hardened. "No, we hit them hard enough that they have to take us seriously. Their respect will come through force, not words." The room erupted into debate, voices clashing like the prelude to battle. Some argued for restraint, others for immediate action. Tim listened, his mind racing through scenarios, calculating risks and potential losses. He glanced at Adrian, who stood silently, his fists clenched at his sides. The younger man's eyes burned with the same anger Tim felt simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Enough," Tim said finally, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "If we're doing this, we need unity. A fragmented response will only lead to our destruction." He met Locke's gaze unflinching. "I'll lead the fleet, but only if we approach this strategically. No reckless heroics. We need to outthink them, not just outfight them." Locke inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "Agreed. We'll convene tomorrow to finalize the battle plan. For now, prepare your crew, Commander." Tim nodded, though his mind was far from at ease. As the meeting adjourned and officers began filing out, Kyle approached him. "You've got that look, Tim," Kyle said, his voice low. "The one that says you're about to shoulder the weight of the galaxy again." Tim allowed a faint smile to flicker across his face. "Isn't that what I signed up for?" Kyle shook his head, his expression softening. "Just don't forget that you're human too. You can't save everyone." The words lingered as Tim returned to the observation deck, seeking solace in the stars. But the nebula's beauty no longer calmed him. His thoughts were consumed by the faces of the colonists in the transmission, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Humanity's peace had been shattered, its trust betrayed. The path ahead was perilous, but one thing was clear. The Empire had underestimated the resolve of the species they sought to control. Tim stared into the void, his jaw set with quiet determination. "If they want a war," he murmured to himself, "then we'll show them what humanity is capable of." The stars outside flickered like distant witnesses to the storm that was about to engulf the galaxy. "The Empire's convoy will pass through here," Tim said, pointing to a narrow corridor between two asteroid fields. "It's a choke point. If we position our fleet just outside their scanner's range, we'll have the element of surprise." Lieutenant Rourke frowned, her arms crossed tightly. "And if their patrols detect us before the ambush?" Tim looked up, his expression steady but sharp. "Then we improvise. But we can't afford hesitation. The convoy carries resources for the Empire's war effort, materials they can't replace easily. Striking here will cripple their supply chain and show them humanity isn't as weak as they think." General Victor Locke watched from the edge of the room, his gaze impassive but his presence a constant weight on the atmosphere. "You've got one shot, Harrow," he said finally. "Make it count." Tim nodded. "We will." As the briefing ended, Tim lingered in the empty room, studying the star charts. He didn't hear Kyle Ellison enter until the engineer spoke. "You're pushing them hard, Tim," Kyle said, his tone a mix of concern and respect. "You sure they're ready for this?" Tim sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ready or not, we don't have a choice. The Empire isn't going to give us time to prepare." Kyle leaned on the table, his wiry frame casting a shadow over the hologram. "Just remember, they're not machines. They'll follow you to hell if you ask. But don't forget what that cost them, or you." Tim didn't reply immediately. He stared at the map, his mind already a dozen steps ahead, anticipating every possible move the Empire might make. Finally, he said, "If we succeed, it'll be worth the cost. If we fail, there won't be a next time." The stellar vortex arrived at the Zenith Nebula under the cover of its advanced cloaking system. The human fleet, smaller but fiercely determined, positioned itself in the shadow of the asteroid belt. The bridge was a hive of controlled chaos, officers relaying data, calibrating weapon systems, and preparing for the fight ahead. "Enemy convoy entering the sector," reported Lieutenant Rourke, her voice calm but edged with tension. 5 ships. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 escorts, and a freighter. Tim's jaw tightened. The heavy cruiser would complicate things, but their plan remained intact. "Hold position. Wait for my signal." Minutes stretched into an eternity as the Empire ships glided into range. The convoy moved with the arrogance of a power unchallenged for millennia, its formation tight, but unprepared for an ambush. "Now!" Tim ordered, his voice like steel. The human fleet erupted from the asteroid field, their weapons blazing. Missiles and energy blasts streaked across the void, slamming into the unsuspecting Empire ships. The freighter's shields collapsed under the assault, and its hull split apart in a fiery explosion. The Empire's response was swift. The heavy cruiser unleashed a barrage of plasma fire, forcing the stellar vortex to maneuver sharply. Tim barked orders, directing his fleet with precision. "Target their engines," he commanded. "We need to disable them, not destroy them." Rourke hesitated, glancing at him. "You're leaving survivors? If we wipe them out, the Empire will send everything they have at us. We need them alive to send a message." The battle raged, the smaller human ships darting between the Empire vessels, exploiting their superior speed and agility. Captain Adrian Cole's corvette executed a daring strafing run, delivering a crippling blow to one of the escorts. "Escort 2 is down." Cole's voice crackled over the comm. "Good work," Tim replied. "Focus on the cruiser." The heavy cruiser loomed like a titan, its guns swiveling to target the stellar vortex. A direct hit shook the bridge, throwing officers from their stations. Alarms blared, and Kyle's voice came through the intercom. "Shields down to 50%. We can't take another hit like that." Tim's mind raced. "Cole, can you flank them?" "Already on it, sir," came the confident reply. Cole's corvette streaked past the cruiser, drawing its fire and creating an opening. The stellar vortex surged forward, its forward cannons hammering the cruiser's engines. A brilliant explosion signaled their success, and the massive ship began to drift, its systems crippled. "Stand down," Tim ordered, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Cease fire." The human fleet regrouped, their victory hard-earned but decisive. On the bridge of the stellar vortex, the tension gave way to quiet relief. "Status report," Tim said. "Freighter destroyed, 2 escorts disabled, and the cruiser neutralized," Rourke replied. "Minimal casualties on our side." Tim nodded, his gaze fixed on the drifting cruiser. "Prepare a boarding team. I want their captain alive." The boarding operation was swift. Adrian Cole led the team, his combat instincts honed from years of skirmishes. They encountered resistance, but overcame it with brutal efficiency. When the alien captain, Zelveron, was brought aboard the stellar vortex, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. The Zarkrell officer was imposing, his insectoid frame towering over the humans. His mandibles clicked in defiance as he was forced to his knees. Tim approached, his expression cold. "You allowed the destruction of Epsilon 4. You thought humanity would cower. Now you see what we're capable of." Zelveron's multifaceted eyes glimmered with disdain. "You are insects playing at war. You cannot comprehend the Empire's power." "Maybe not," Tim replied evenly. "But we just took your convoy. Imagine what we'll do next." The alien's silence spoke volumes. As the human fleet prepared to return to friendly space, the victory felt bittersweet. They had struck the first blow, but the cost of defiance was yet to be seen. Tim stood on the bridge, watching the stars slip past. "We've made our move," he said quietly to Rourke. "Now we see how the Empire responds." Her reply was soft but firm. "They'll come at us with everything they have." Tim nodded. "Let them. We'll be ready." But as the stellar vortex sailed into the void, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on him. This was only the beginning, and humanity's survival hung by a thread. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. The bridge of the stellar vortex was a symphony of controlled chaos, the steady rhythm of commands and reports weaving through the tense air. Commander Tim Harrow stood at its center, his gaze fixed on the tactical display projecting the vast emptiness of Orion's edge. The Galactic Empire's retaliation had been swift, their forces converging on human-held territory with a precision that spoke to their centuries of dominance. "Incoming transmission from Fleet Command," Lieutenant Rourke announced, her voice taut with urgency. "Put it through," Tim said, his jaw tightening. General Victor Locke's face appeared on the main screen, his expression carved from stone. "Tim, The Empire's counteroffensive has hit 6 colonies in the past 48 hours. Casualties are catastrophic. Tim's stomach nodded, but he kept his voice steady. Do we know their next target? Locke nodded grimly. Orion's Edge. They're sending a full battle group to wipe out our defenses and secure the region. We'll hold the line, Tim said firmly. Locke's gaze lingered on him, a rare flicker of doubt breaking through his hardened exterior. You'd better. If they take Orion's Edge, they'll have a direct route to Earth. Humanity won't recover from that. As the transmission ended, Tim turned back to his crew. You heard him. Prepare all ships for engagement. This is where we make our stand. Hours later, the Empire's fleet emerged from hyperspace, their ships gleaming like predators in the void. The human forces, though smaller in number, held their position, their weapons primed. Enemy fleet in formation, Rourke reported, her voice betraying no fear. 10 capital ships, dozens of escorts. Tim's eyes scanned the display, his mind calculating the odds. They'll expect us to hold back, to play defensively. We won't give them that satisfaction. The battle began with a thunderous volley of plasma fire and missiles, the void between the fleets igniting in bursts of violent light. Human ships moved with an agility born of necessity, darting between the Empire's heavier vessels. Tim directed his fleet with precision, calling out orders with a calm authority that steadied his crew. The stellar vortex led the charge, its advanced railguns tearing through the shields of an enemy frigate. But for every victory, there was a cost. Shields at 40%. Kyle Ellison's voice crackled over the comm. We can't sustain this kind of firepower. Tim gritted his teeth. Keep us in the fight. We need more time. Across the battlefield, Captain Adrian Cole's corvette executed a daring maneuver, slipping beneath the belly of an Empire cruiser and delivering a devastating payload to its reactor core. The explosion lit up the dark expanse, a brief but vital triumph. Cole's voice came through the comm, breathless but triumphant. One down, moving to the next target. But the Empire's forces were relentless. A destroyer broke through the human line, its weapons tearing into a cluster of smaller ships. The screams of dying crew members filled the comm before the signal cut out. Commander, Rourke said, her voice tight, we're losing ground. Tim's mind raced, searching for a way to turn the tide. Redirect power to the forward railguns. Focus all fire on that destroyer. The crew obeyed without hesitation, their faith in him unwavering. The stellar vortex surged forward, its weapons blazing. The destroyer's shields buckled under the assault, and a final missile strike from Cole's corvette sent it spiraling into the void. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Tim remained focused. The battle was far from over. As the engagement raged on, an encrypted transmission came through from Adrian Cole. Commander, we've located an Empire weapons platform in orbit of the nearby moon. If we can disable it, their fleet will lose its long-range firepower. Tim hesitated for only a moment. Do it. Take whatever support you need. Cole led a small task force to the moon, their ships slipping past the chaos of the battlefield. The weapons platform was heavily guarded, its automated turrets already targeting the approaching humans. Incoming fire, Cole shouted, maneuvering his ship through a hail of plasma bolts. His team worked with deadly precision, coordinating their attacks to disable the platform's defenses. Inside the platform, Cole and his Marines fought their way through corridors filled with alien soldiers. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and scorched flesh. Cole's pulse rifle barked with lethal efficiency, each shot bringing them closer to their objective. Plant the charges, he ordered, covering his team as they rigged the platform's power core to detonate. Back on the stellar vortex, Tim monitored the operation, his hands clenched into fists. Every second felt like an eternity. Charges set, Cole reported, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. We're heading back. The explosion was visible even from the battlefield, a brilliant burst that shattered the moon's serene orbit. Without the weapons platform, The Empire's fleet faltered, their firepower diminished. Tim seized the opportunity. All ships, press the attack. Break their formation. The human fleet rallied, their resolve strengthened by the destruction of the platform. The stellar vortex led the charge, its weapons tearing through the remaining Empire ships. One by one, the enemy vessels fell, their once imposing presence reduced to burning wreckage. As the last Empire ship retreated into hyperspace, a hush fell over the battlefield. The human fleet had held Orion's edge, but the cost was staggering. Debris and lifeless ships drifted silently, a grim reminder of the price of survival. Tim stood on the bridge, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "Status report," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Significant losses," Rourke replied, her tone somber. "But we held the line." Tim nodded, though the victory felt hollow. He turned to the viewport, staring into the void. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Kyle approached, his face lined with worry. "Tim, you need to rest." Tim shook his head. "Not yet. We've got wounded to tend to, repairs to make." "You're not a machine," Kyle said softly. Tim's voice was steady but distant. "No, but I don't have the luxury of stopping." In the quiet that followed, the weight of their situation settled over the crew. They had survived the Empire's onslaught, but every victory came at a cost that could not be ignored. As Tim turned back to the tactical display, his mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. The Empire would not let this defeat go unanswered. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The stellar vortex drifted in the shadows of the Tartarus Rift, its crew working tirelessly to prepare for humanity's greatest challenge yet. Tim Harrow stood in the center of the bridge, a steady pillar amidst the whirlwind of activity. The rift was humanity's last line of defense, a labyrinthine region of collapsing stars and gravitational anomalies. It was here that the Empire would launch their final assault, and it was here that humanity would make its stand. Admiral Victor Locke's voice crackled over the comm, a somber weight in every word. "Tim, the Empire's flagship Eternal Sovereign has entered the rift. Its escorts are numerous, and their fleet is at full strength. This is it." Tim's reply was calm, a mask over the turmoil in his chest. "Understood, Admiral. We'll do what needs to be done." He turned to his crew, meeting each gaze. "This is our last stand. Every decision we've made, every sacrifice, has led us here. If we fail, there's no one left to stop them." His voice sharpened, cutting through the heavy silence. "But we won't fail. Humanity didn't survive centuries of strife to be extinguished by an empire that underestimates us. You've trained for this moment. Trust in your skills and trust in each other." The crew's response was resolute. The tension in the air transformed into determination. The Eternal Sovereign arrived like a shadow over the rift, its massive frame dwarfing anything humanity had ever faced. Its escort fleet spread out like a net, methodically closing off escape routes. The human ships moved into position, smaller and fewer in number, but bristling with defiance. Kyle Ellison's voice came through the comm, tinged with urgency. "Tim, the Sovereign's energy readings are off the charts. Whatever they're powering up, it's not just a weapon. It's a planet killer." Tim felt the chill of those words but didn't falter. "Then we'll stop it." "Kyle, I need a vulnerability. Now." "I'll find it," Kyle replied, already pulling up schematics. The battle began with a ferocity that eclipsed all before it. The Empire's fleet advanced with ruthless precision, their superior firepower scorching through the void. The stellar vortex led the counterattack, its railguns firing relentlessly as it maneuvered through the chaos. "Enemy bombers closing in," shouted Rourke. "Divert interceptors to cover our flank," Tim ordered, his focus unbroken. Adrian Cole's voice cut through the calm. "I've got them." Moving to intercept, Cole's corvette weaved through the enemy bombers, tearing through their ranks with pinpoint accuracy. His daring maneuvers bought precious time for the fleet, but the cost was high. A direct hit rocked his ship, and his voice came back strained but defiant. Still in the fight, Commander. You'll have to try harder to get rid of me. On the stellar vortex. Kyle's voice broke through the din. Tim, I've found something. The Sovereign's power core is shielded by an array of emitters, but there's a flaw in their alignment. If we can get close enough to overload them, we can expose the core. Tim nodded sharply. Rourke, plot a course. We're taking the fight to them. The stellar vortex surged forward, cutting through the heart of the battle. Enemy fire rained down, but the crew held steady. Cole's corvette joined them, providing cover as they neared the Eternal Sovereign. As they closed in, the enormity of the flagship became clear. Its hull bristled with weaponry, and its shield shimmered like a barrier of stars. Kyle, we're in position, Tim said. What's the plan? I've rerouted power to our EMP cannon, Kyle replied. It's a one-shot deal. If we miss, we won't get another chance. Then we won't miss, Tim said firmly. The stellar vortex fired its EMP cannon, the pulse slamming into the Eternal Sovereign's shield emitters. Sparks erupted across the flagship's surface as its defenses flickered and failed, exposing the glowing core beneath. Core exposed. Kyle shouted, "We've got a shot." Tim's voice rang out over the comm. All ships, focus fire on the core. Bring it down. The human fleet rallied, their weapons converging on the vulnerable core. The Eternal Sovereign unleashed a torrent of fire, its desperation palpable. Ships on both sides erupted in flames, the battle devolving into chaos. As the core began to destabilize, Tim knew the end was near. Kyle, what happens if that core goes critical? Kyle hesitated. It'll take the whole fleet with it, including us. Tim took a breath, his decision made. Rourke, prepare for full retreat. Signal all ships to pull back once the core detonates. Rourke's voice was steady despite the chaos. Understood, Commander. Adrian Cole's voice came through the comm one last time. Tim, my ship's too damaged to pull out. I'll stay behind. Make sure the core goes down. Tim's chest tightened. Cole, don't. You need this, Commander. Cole interrupted, his tone resolute. It's been an honor. Before Tim could respond, Cole's corvette surged forward, diving into the heart of the flagship. His final transmission was brief. For humanity, the explosion that followed was blinding, a supernova destruction that tore through the Eternal Sovereign and its fleet. The shockwave rippled across the rift, scattering debris and swallowing the Empire's might. The stellar vortex barely escaped the blast, its crew shaken but alive. As the rift settled into silence, the realization of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. Tim stood on the bridge, his gaze distant. They had won, but the cost was immeasurable. Cole's sacrifice weighed heavily on him, a reminder of the price of freedom. Rourke approached, her expression a mix of sorrow and pride. We did it, Commander. The Empire's fleet is destroyed. Tim nodded slowly. It's a victory, he said, though the word felt hollow. As the human fleet regrouped, a transmission from Admiral Locke came through. His voice carried a rare note of hope. You've done the impossible, Harrow. Humanity owes you everything. Tim didn't respond immediately. He turned to the viewport, staring into the endless void. The Empire was broken, but the scars of the war would linger. We'll rebuild, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. For those we've lost, for the future. The crew around him stood in silence, their grief tempered by resolve. They had survived the war, but the fight for humanity's place in the galaxy was just beginning. And as the stars stretched out before them, Tim Harrow knew one thing with certainty. They would endure.